How did the warrior class rise and eventually seize Japan? What were the origins of the great families of the Taira, Minamoto, and Fujiwara? How did the first mighty shogunate come into existence, and later what caused its fall? How did the wars throughout the 12th to 14th centuries come to influence the eventual outbreak of Japan's Sengoku period? These questions and more were explored in great detail throughout the 8 episodes of my updated Setting the Stage series. The purpose of which, obviously, to revisit some of my earliest videos to enhance them with new and expanded information. The original main goal of this channel when I first started it years ago was to tell the story of Japan's iconic warring age, the Sengoku Jidai, hence the need to first set the stage before diving into such a complex yet fascinating part of history. And although this series exists as this foundational piece to a larger picture, that does not diminish the actual significance of its content, asking these important questions of how and why. Questions we have also explored through separate videos, and perhaps will in the future even come to explore through further series. Yet now, with the completion of my recent updated Setting the Stage series, I think it is a good time to look back on what was covered within it, so that we can perhaps gain a clearer understanding of the changes Japan underwent throughout this time. The great origins of the samurai, their military governments, and the many wars which transformed the country. We began by examining the rise of the Yamato Kingdom, an early age which spanned the Kofun and Asuka periods. Through this, we witnessed the power dynamics of the emperor and the court, as well as the implementation of the Taika reform, and further Ritsuryo codes implemented to strengthen the imperial governing systems. We examined Japan's relationship with regional powers of the Korean peninsula, including that of their ally, the Kingdom of Baekje, which would eventually be defeated, but not before Yamato forces attempted to militarily intervene, only to be pushed out. This led to new fears of an attack from the mainland, which perhaps propelled the construction of a national army of conscripts to defend Japan. Yet this army would never face off against any force from the mainland, and would instead be tested in battle against the northern Amishi tribes, with whom the Yamato went to war in 774. It was here that the conscript army would actually fare rather well, especially when under the command of competent military leaders appointed by the court. Through these leaders, we finally see the emergence of the title Sei Taishogun, meaning the great general who subdues the barbarians. The war against the Amishi would end by 811, in which the Yamato court would prove successful in driving the Amishi back north and into Hokkaido. It is here, as we enter into the early years of the classical Heian period, we finally see the full dismantling of the old conscript national army, which had run its course and had even become a liability in some cases. As in its place, new, more efficient groups of professional warriors were rising in the provinces. In the second episode, we explored the continued rise of these warrior bands as they expanded to include members of the middle and lower aristocracy. Meanwhile, in the capital, the Fujiwara family were entering into their prime, seizing the court and governing it with near total control. Yet, warrior influence was soon to seep into the confines of the imperial city as well, as in time, Miyako no Musha, warriors of the capital, began to emerge as prominent figures in service to court nobility. With this new developing warrior culture on the rise both in the provinces and in Kyoto, we would eventually see the birth of the famous warrior houses of the Taira and Minamoto, who were descended from past emperors. As conflict between such houses and more widely between multiple sub-branches became a frequent occurrence, we would eventually see the famous rebellion of a certain Taira no Masakado, who threatened to upturn the established order. Although Masakado would eventually be defeated, his rebellion served as a potential foreshadowing of the future strife to come caused by powerful warrior elites. In episode 3, we saw the Fujiwara dominance collapse through a series of violent clashes within Kyoto, starting with the Hogen Rebellion of 1156, which erupted out of an imperial succession dispute. It was here Taira no Kiyomori and Minamoto no Yoshitomo would defeat opposing members of their own families to secure victory for Emperor Go-Shirakawa. Yet their victory had lasting implications to how far-reaching the authority of warriors went. For what real power did court aristocrats hold if when conflict erupted, it would really be the warriors who would settle disputes? Above all else, the Hogen Rebellion had catapulted the status of Taira no Kiyomori, whose influence over the imperial city would only come to grow over the following years, leading to the eventual Heiji Rebellion of 1160, when members of the Fujiwara and Minamoto struck in aims to seize power for themselves. They would ultimately fail, however, and their rebellion was crushed by Kiyomori and his allies. Now, with little obstacles remaining, Kiyomori was free to sink his claws deep into the government. The age of Taira dominance was truly at hand, as the remaining sons of the defeated Minamoto were sent into exile. Episode 4 covered the outbreak of the Genpei War, as Kiyomori's ambition led to the opening of conflict against a resurgent Minamoto 20 years later, after he had dethroned the previous emperor in favor of his own grandson, the Taira-born Antoku. In the east, we saw the rise of Minamoto no Yoritomo, who assumed new leadership over the family and began to establish his own power base in Kamakura. Yet as time went on, the situation evolved into a stalemate, as the Taira were unable to dislodge Yoritomo, and Yoritomo was unable and unwilling to carry his advance west. This would result in a lull in the conflict, which was further aided by a famine, which would bring the war to a temporary halt. However, by early 1181, Kiyomori would pass away, leaving the Taira in the hands of his grandson Munemori. Episode 5 picks up in 1183, as the famine subsided and armies were able to march once more. However, instead of the Taira pushing yet again against Yoritomo, they would end up taking the fight against his cousin, Minamoto no Yoshinaka. Surprisingly, Yoshinaka would crush the Taira forces at the Battle of Kurikara Pass, sending them reeling back towards Kyoto, with Yoshinaka's forces in hot pursuit. Left with little choice, the Taira were forced to abandon Kyoto as Yoshinaka liberated the imperial city. Yet, things would soon enough start to deteriorate as Yoshinaka's own ambition began to get the better of him. Eventually, he would rebel, forcing Yoritomo's forces to have to put him down. Following Yoshinaka's defeat, the Minamoto armies, led valiantly by Yoritomo's brother, Minamoto no Yoshitsune, continued to hunt down and destroy the last vestiges of the Taira, fighting in several more epic clashes before finally defeating them once and for all at the legendary sea battle of Dan no Ura, as the remaining Taira warriors, along with their child emperor, would all drown themselves rather than be captured or slain by the victorious Minamoto. Episode 6 covered the aftermath of the Genpei War, as Minamoto no Yoritomo assumed control. However, he still needed to tie up some significant loose ends, such as that of his brother, the war hero Minamoto no Yoshitsune, who stood as a potential rival to his power. Yoritomo would have Yoshitsune hunted down and finally slain by 1189. 3 years later, he would claim the title of Sei Taishogun, transforming his military power base in Kamakura into Japan's first great shogunate. However, Yoritomo's reign would not last for long, as he would die suddenly in 1199, allowing his wife's family, the Hojo, to slowly expand their influence over the new Bakufu. As although the Kamakura shogunate would originally be founded within the Minamoto family of Yoritomo, by 1219 Yoritomo's line within the Bakufu was ended, and the Hojo regency had firmly come to dominate the inner workings of the military government. Episode 7 moved several decades into the future as Japan would come to be threatened by the mighty Mongol Empire of Kublai Khan. It came in the 1270s, after repeated attempts by Kublai to establish friendly relations with Japan amid conflict on the mainland. Japan would continually ignore Mongol attempts at peaceful diplomacy, eventually resulting in the launching of an initial invasion in 1274. It was here, contrary to popular belief, the Japanese actually fared rather well against the initial Mongol onslaught, holding them back until they were finally forced to withdraw back towards Korea. A second invasion would later come in 1281, yet it would fare even worse for the invaders, as the Japanese, having learned from their first experience fighting the Mongols, would completely halt any attempt for them to make a landing. Unable to make any headway, a typhoon would give the Mongols a convenient excuse to break off the second and final attempt they would make to seize Japan. Episode 8 brought us the grand conclusion of the series, as we covered the chaotic end of the Kamakura Bakufu and the rise of the new Ashikaga shogunate. It began with the ascension of the ambitious Emperor Go-Daigo, whose efforts to re-establish imperial supremacy across Japan would lead to the rise of many disgruntled samurai who eagerly took up his banner against the shogunate, with such figures as that of Kusunoki Masashige, Nita Yoshisada, and Ashikaga Takauji. Through their efforts, the Kamakura Bakufu would be destroyed. Yet, Go-Daigo's own inability to rein in the warrior class following his Kinmu restoration would lead to a new revolt, as his former ally, Takauji, would betray him and eventually force him out of the imperial city by 1336. Takauji would establish a new Ashikaga shogunate within Kyoto, while Go-Daigo would form a new imperial court of his own in Nara, beginning the Nanboku-cho, a period of incessant war between the northern and southern courts, a period which gradually shifted power further into the hands of provincial lords and weakened the authority of the new Bakufu. Although the third shogun of the Ashikaga shogunate, Ashikaga Yoshimitsu, would bring an end to the warring period in 1392, by then the damage had already been done, and with weak shogunal authority in the capital and powerful warrior leaders rising throughout the countryside, it was only a matter of time until a far more devastating age of war and transformation was to commence. So, as one might assess, the samurai were untamable, and their warrior culture infectious. Their coming dominance over the emperor and the court by the mid-12th century was perhaps inevitable. Yet, it was Yoritomo's establishment of the Kamakura Bakufu which would truly bring the warrior class into a more complete sense of power. Had the Kamakura Bakufu been able to maintain its strength, especially after defeating the Mongol invasions, history might have looked very different. However, budding resentment, a deteriorating foundation, and an ambitious emperor would end its existence. From there, it would be nearly 3 centuries before Japan would ever face some semblance of internal stability again. And with the rise of the Bakufu and the outbreak of the Nanboku-cho, the power dynamics across the country continued to shift as the shogunate continued to weaken and provincial warrior elites continued to grow stronger. The inevitable start of the Sengoku period, with the chaos of the Onin War in 1467, was perhaps too an inevitability born by centuries of war and ambition. I hope you enjoyed not only this video recapping the series, but also the updated series as a whole. I very much enjoyed returning to these topics, diving deeper into researching them and creating new, longer and more in-depth episodes telling the story of the rise of the samurai. I'm very proud of how this series turned out, and investing my time into making these episodes has only deepened my fascination with Japanese history. In the future, I also plan to return to update sections of my Sengoku Jidai series as well. I feel it is my duty to ensure I am providing you with not only accurate information, but also delivering it in a compelling and engaging manner. Yet besides that, also keep an eye out for the eventual continuation of the Edo period series, which I'll be diving back into very soon. With that all said, thank you for watching, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell if you enjoyed this video and found it to be most informative.